So firstly, I'm delighted to welcome back our former committee member, Graham Boston, whose regular attenders of you will know from his insightful approach to astrology at Aquarius 7 events over many years. And so thanks, Graham, for being the interviewer this evening. And we'll be in conversation with Anne Whitaker, who I'm equally delighted to welcome to Aquarius 7 for the first time. Anne's been doing astrology for about 40 years. Remember the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction of 1983, apparently, which set those things
That was the one.
I would like to also mention her recent book is called Postcards to the Future, Mercurial Musings. And she has a number of other books, which I will put the link to those in the chat box. Do go online and look at the many fascinating subjects that Anne has written about. And I will hand you over to Graham and Anne.
Thanks. Thank you, Chris. Thank you. And thank you for inviting me to interview Anne. I'm really looking forward to our conversation this evening. Before I ask any questions of Anne, I'm just going to do a brief introduction so that we know a little bit more about Anne before we begin. So Anne's had a long career in astrology, and she combines a deep knowledge of the subject with the thoughtfulness and observational skills of a good writer. And Anne has written for many magazines, including the Mountain Astrologer, the AA Journal, and Dell Horoscope magazine. And she, as Chris said, she's the author of several books, including Jupiter Meets Uranus on the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction, the Moon's Nodes in Action, and as Chris said, Anne's latest book is Postcards to the Future, which I've had the pleasure of reading over the last few days, and I'm really enjoying it. It's great to read. But it is the subtitle is Mercurial Musings, and I love that aspect of it. It's a compendium of writings from different magazines and essays and articles, and I love the moving from subject to subject in the book. It's great.
Well, I do have Mercury as my ruling planet, so well, you know.
Okay. And just to say that Anne also has taught in adult education and has counselled in adult social work. And as an astrologer, she has a certificate from the Faculty of Astrological Studies and a diploma from the Centre for Psychological Astrology, or CPA. And Anne writes a blog called Writing from the 12th House at her website, which is anne-whitaker.com, and that's Whitaker with one T. So welcome to Aquarius 7, Anne, and we're delighted to be able to interview you.
I'm very happy to be here. And I'd also like to say that Graham and I had a ice-breaking chat on Monday morning, which could have gone on all day if we hadn't had other things to do. So it was great fun.
Yeah,
good way to spend a wet Monday morning in Glasgow, I can assure you.
Yes, yeah, indeed. So to start at the beginning of your astrological journey, Anne, how did the astrological muse first catch you?
Well, it came for me in a very left field way indeed, because at the time that I first encountered a pair of astrologers in a laundrette in Bath, and I do apologise, some of you will have heard this story before, but it's a good story. This was in 1974, so I realised when I was thinking about that, that's 50 years ago. So there I was unexpectedly in the laundrette in Bath, doing my washing as you do, annoying nobody, and this very interesting looking couple came in with their child, and he looked a bit like an unmade bed. He was very rumpled looking, and she looked a bit like Cher, you know, of Sonny and Cher. And little girl was delightful, and I let her put my money in the machine. We became great friends, and they invited me back for a cup of tea. And when I found out that they were astrologers, inside myself, I was horrified because I really fancied myself as a Marxist in those days. And I thought astrology was a load of old rubbish, based on the usual ignorance and prejudice. I knew nothing about it. But I went back with them because they were lovely people, and he insisted on doing my chart. He was so charming that I couldn't say no. I have a Mars-Uranus conjunction, and so I'm very good at telling people to get lost if I don't want to talk to them. But he was so charming, he got through that. And I still have the chart that he drew up by hand, because they were both artists. And I left his house an hour and a half later feeling as though I'd had my head hit with a sack full of sand, because I was so, with a sock full of sand rather, because I was so stunned at the accuracy and depth that he was able to see in this piece of paper. And he said to me, he said, you may be what you consider to be a Marxist just now, but you have a very strong spiritual side. This is him looking at my 12th house overload. And he said, you'll either end up doing this or something like it in about 7 years' time. And of course, I knew once I started studying astrology that he was looking at Uranus approaching my Scorpio IC and South Node and various other things. I mean, it really did look like in 7 or 8 years' time, it was a case of come in, number 23, your time is up. But I was I really was shattered by this. I thought, but I went away and gradually forgot about it. And then 7 years later, a friend of mine who I respected unexpectedly handed me this astrology book, which was Alan Oken's the Horoscope, the Road and its Travelers, which is a wonderful book. And I thought, I better read this because, I'll upset him if I don't. And within about 4 pages, I'll never forget this. It felt as though somebody was reaching out of the book and grabbing me by the collar and saying, you're for me. And that was it.
Yeah.
That was it. And so I went and signed up with the faculty. I told nobody because I was so embarrassed at being interested in this subject. And of course, after a year of studying with the faculty, I realized I could do the same thing as Elias had done for me. And that was me beginning as an astrologer I got my certificate in 1983. I think I had set up my first class then. And I found that having a background in adult education, psychiatry, counseling, social work was so helpful because it gave me confidence that this information and this knowledge I realized was really powerful. And you had to be responsible about how you used it. And I thought, well, I'm unlikely to do too much harm here because I have this background. I know how to work with people. And that was me, 1983. And I had a long engagement with Neptune. Neptune opposed all my Leo planets in the 12th house, from the 6th house for the whole time, 1998 to 2012. And about 2001, 2002, I was really, really felled by Neptune and had to retreat for a few years. I wrote some books and did a lot of reading and so on. But that was the beginning of my astrology career, completely out of the blue, as befits Uranus going over your IC. So I've now got Uranus going over my MC, exactly opposite where it was then. So I'm going, what is going to happen next? So if I disappear in a puff of smoke during this discussion, do not be surprised.
Well, perhaps now you can look back at that career and it's all inside you now, as befits the that half return, if you like.
Yeah.
Well, that sounds like an extraordinary meeting, and I'm impressed that the astrologer that you met, or both of them, were able to draw up your chart by hand so quickly for you.
Yeah. It was amazing. I still have it. If I had thought about it, I could have dug it out of my archive and showed it to you. But anyway, it's a document that I treasure, and it makes you realize, I think, one of the issues that we have to face as astrologers is what our attitude is to the balance between fate and free will. And like everybody else, I do not know what the balance is. But what I do know from certain things that have happened in my life is Liz Green said to us in a seminar in the 1990s, Liz was great for gnomic pronouncements that one tends never to forget. And she looked at us and she said, you know, we 20th century people, because it was still 20th century then, we are not as free as we think we are. And I mean, I can certainly tell you, if there is time, I can certainly tell you another pretty devastating example of the fates reaching in. But having said that, I really think that we have quite a lot of freedom in terms of how we work with these images in the horoscope. And being able to learn astrology and being able to combine that with being prepared to look at yourself honestly is a wonderful way of freeing up whatever gifts you actually have to be as useful a person as you can be in the world. And that was my commitment. That's been my commitment throughout all the careers I've had, all 4 of them, writing, teaching, counselling, and astrology. My commitment has been to enable people to be the best they can be, given the gifts and the limitations that they come into this world with. And I think that helping people to accept the difficult parts of themselves as well as the gifts is terribly, terribly important, because if you can forgive yourself for your inadequacies and your difficulties, then I think it helps you to be more reconciled with your life, and that frees up your creative energy to move forward and hopefully offer some value to the world you're in and the people that you deal with. Because, I mean, I certainly am speaking from hard personal experience, because I would like to know if there's anyone in this group who is delighted to be born with exact Saturn-Pluto conjunct Mercury, Venus, the Moon, and the Sun, because that's me. And certain aspects of that have been very difficult indeed to deal with. Fortunately, it's all squared by Jupiter in the 3rd house. So uncrushable optimism has been one of my signatures throughout life. But I really do think that coming to terms with your gifts as well as your pains, I think astrology is a wonderful tool for that. I really do.
So in your practice, Anne, did you, presumably you used your counselling skills and experience?
Yeah.
So did you take people through a kind of counselling experience as part of the consultation?
Well, I don't know.
Did you also do a series of consultations with people?
I think that, I mean, I should say that I now, for the last few years, I don't do readings anymore, but I do pass inquiries on to reputable colleagues and also to my own students. And I keep my hand in by mentoring students who are doing reputable courses themselves. I think that we all have our own individual way of reading a horoscope. What I'd certainly do is I make quite a lot of, I'm using the present tense for convenience, although it's in the past now, but I always made quite a lot of notes before I ever encountered my client, maybe half an hour, 3/4 of an hour, just thinking about the images, thinking about the transits, looking at the progressions. And that was as much to give me confidence that I had something to say. And then I would put that aside, and having a counselling background was very useful, because you do use, whether you like it or not, whether you admit it or not, you are using counselling skills in working with the strengths and the vulnerabilities of the person sitting across the table from you. And so I was very grateful for that. And then people come in and you ask them, why are you here now? And what do you wish to get out of this session? And I have to say that I can't think of any more useful, clear way of beginning a session, because most of the people who come to us don't know any astrology. And it's not our job to be clever and to bamboozle in most technical terms. It's our job to be clear and straightforward and respond to whatever the person brings that they need to talk about.
Right.
So that's kind of been my approach. And I also think you need to have good boundaries. I mean, I think people need to know that they're in for an hour or an hour and a half or 2 hours, because that makes them feel safe. So creating an atmosphere of safety and security, I think, is very important. And I also used to say to people at the beginning of any session, look, I'm a stranger to you. I have to earn your trust. So if you if I ask you any questions or make any comments that you don't want to respond to, then please feel free to keep me out. Because our job is not to be invasive of other people's privacy.
I think
is that a reasonable answer to your question? Because I do have a tendency to ramble. So
that was a very good answer.
Feel free to interrupt if you feel that I'm rambling too much.
No, that's fine. I think as part of your training at the CPA, it was standard practice to be in therapy for whilst you were training. And how important do you think that was to your professional practice later on as an astrologer?
Well, I mean, I was always in supervision regularly as a counsellor, always. And Liz Green's view was that you had no business poking around in somebody else's psyche unless you were prepared to submit yourself to the same thing. And I completely agreed with that. So I've continued my supervision or mentoring or whatever you want to call it, always. I've never not had my work consulted with or supervised or mentored. And I'm happy to mention by name my current supervisor, Juliet Sharman Burke, who is a very respected writer on tarot and a member of the CPA for a long, long time, decades and decades. She has been my mentor for probably about 25 years, maybe even longer. And I don't see her so much now, obviously, because I don't work directly with clients. But I do still check in with her on a regular basis, just over my writing and my mentoring of students, because I think we all need somebody to keep an eye on how we are practicing, because somebody else can see your projections when you maybe can't. And I think if you're going through a period of very considerable crisis in your own life, which we all go through, and I've certainly gone through, then you need to be careful, because as sure as anything, people who have a similar set of challenges shown through transits and progressions will come your way. I mean, I remember having a serious problem with one of my siblings who's now sadly not here anymore. And I had several clients coming my way during that time. And honestly, some of it was like listening to my own family script. And I think in situations like that, you need an outsider to keep an eye on what you are saying to your clients, because we can all project from our own pain and from our own prejudices. We can't eliminate that at all fully, but we should at least try.
Yes, that's a very good illustration of why it's useful and important to have supervision. And I think you've written on the ethics of astrology, haven't you, Anne? And
yes, I have.
So what constitutes good and bad practice from your point of view?
What a question. My God, we could be here all day on that one. Again, I feel very, what's the word I'm looking for? I feel very grateful and very humbled by the teaching that I gained from the practice of social work, in particularly 10 years of social work. I was in social work for 10 years, both in local authority work and psychiatry. And what you learn from that is how to hammer your ethics out on the anvil of actual, real experience and practice. And one of the things you learn is that there's a spectrum. And there are some people who, if you get them in the right moment at the right time, you can help a lot. And there's a kind of middle range of people who you can help a bit. And there's a bunch of people at the bottom end of the spectrum who really, you can't really help at all. Now, that's not a rigid classification, because obviously there are always people who buck the trend. I mean, I've come across young folks who had terrible lives. I mean, I'm thinking of one in particular who I first saw when she was 14, and I had to take her family into care. And she's the one client who I'm still in touch with, and it's her 60th birthday this year. So people like that teach you an enormous amount about the limits of your power, because I think that one of the major things about being ethically scrupulous is to recognize what your personal limitations are. And also being in local authority work teaches you about confidentiality. It teaches you about cooperating with colleagues. It teaches you about when to share information, when not to. And I think that one has to treat one's fellow human beings as one would wish to be treated oneself. And you have to have some sort of idea about what you would do if people were suicidal, or if people came in and confessed criminality as an astrologer. I was very grateful for my years in psychiatry, because it means that if somebody comes in and you're doing an astrology reading with them, then you can spot very quickly if they're psychotic, or if there's various kinds of mental health issues which are beyond your capacity. And I think one of the major things about being an ethically practicing astrologer is to have a list of reputable practitioners to whom you can refer on. I mean, for example, my colleague Jane Ritter-Patrick, who is a very fine medical astrologer, and there were times when I would refer people on to Jane because I don't have particular expertise in talking to people about medical stuff from the chart, so I would refer them to Jane. And I worked in that way, and if there was anything where the person was in some kind of danger, or their relatives were in some kind of danger, I would always have somebody I could consult to work out what I was going to do. So I think considerable care of people, acceptance of your own limitations, having a good referral network, and just recognizing that, we're all fallible behind our carefully constructed masks, which we all have to a greater or lesser extent. We're all vulnerable. And I think you need to carry all these awarenesses with you when you're sitting in a room with your astrology clients and with your students. I mean, I used to, Carol Bone here was one of my students for many a long year, poor girl. She seems to be remarkably okay despite that. But I took the view with my students that I had to be very clear with them that what came out in the room stayed in the room. I really emphasized confidentiality. And also, I don't know if other astrologers watching this and who are teachers may disagree with this, but I took the view that if I was going to if they were going to expose their horoscopes to me, then I should be prepared to do the same thing, with the proviso that you don't use that as an opportunity to indulge yourself. Because particularly somebody like me with half a dozen planets in Leo, the opportunity to climb on the soapbox and declaim endlessly about oneself is really, really can be quite compelling. So as a teacher, if you're going to share your own chart, it's got to be very judicious, and you've got to give most of the commitment to your students. But I think that sharing it creates a kind of mini research laboratory where, you could say, okay, we're going to look at people's moon. Where's your moon, Carol? Your moon's in, I can't remember where, it's in Pisces or Scorpio or somewhere. And your sun's in Sagittarius. So what is that? What do you think that means? So you get a lot of fun working in that way. But I was always very serious when it came to the responsibility that comes to a person if they decide to study astrology, particularly if they want to go on and be a practitioner, because we have a big responsibility to do no harm.
Yes, indeed. Indeed, I quite agree. And you mentioned freedom earlier, and I think one of the just talking about things astrologers can get wrong is fating people. Our words have such great power, and I think an astrologer's words have perhaps even more power than everyday words that we use. Because we deal with such large concepts and the fate and the issues of fate and free will. So we have to be very careful, from my point of view, not to say with certainty, because I don't think we know. I think we have to have some humility with certainty about what is going to happen to somebody. And certainly if there are difficult transits coming up, it's very easy to scare people. And I think, it's good to always remember that we as astrologers, wield power through our words.
I absolutely agree with you about that. I really do. Have you come across the work of, sadly now, the late Donna Cunningham?
Donna,
She was a
yeah.
Donna Cunningham. She's
a
a very
long time
fine.
ago, yeah.
Yeah, and she had a back. I had some contact with her for quite a while, for a few years. But she had a background in social work and psychiatry, and she was very down to earth and very, very practical and very much into making astrologers aware of the power they had and the responsibility that went with it. And she had a section on her website listing. It was called "Awful Things Astrologers Say to Their Clients." And honestly, you go and look through that and your hair stands on end. So I used to sometimes refer my students to read that and say, look, just go and look at that, because it makes you realize the damage you can do. I mean, I don't want to be too heavy, because I really do think that astrology, well practiced and responsibly practiced, is a great gift to the world. I mean, I wouldn't have done it for 40 years if I hadn't thought that. But I go along with Richard Tarnas. I don't know if any of you know Dr. Richard Tarnas's work. He's a very well-known American astrologer. He is, I think he's retired now, maybe. I don't know. I don't think any of us retire. I think we just fall over, basically, while still clutching charts in our hands. That's what I intend to do anyway, unless somebody decides to bump me off, of course. That's always a possibility. But Richard Tarnas wrote this wonderful book called The Passion of the Western Mind, which is a history of the development of Western thought. And he also has another book called Cosmos and Psyche, which is a pretty heavy read, but it's really, really good. And he made a statement which really grabbed me, because it summed up what I thought. And he says, the thing you have to understand about astrology is that it is archetypally predictable, but not concretely predictable. And so if you, let's take a simple example. Let's just say, before I go into this, astrology's record on concrete, accurate prediction is, to say the least, patchy. And I think we all need to be humble and remember that, but just to give you a very simple example, which I used to use with my students, you're doing a reading with somebody and they've got a very prominent Venus in, let's put it in the 7th house for the sake of argument. And they've got a Uranus transit going through their 7th house, and it's heading for that Venus. It's crossed their descendant. Now, you do not say to somebody, your relationships are in trouble. I think maybe, your marriage is going to fall apart or whatever, because astrologers say that kind of thing to people. If you doubt it, go and read the Donna Cunningham's site, which is still up, and the section which says awful things astrologers say to their clients, because it's all there. So what you would do is look at the archetypal combination of Venus and Uranus and very simply say to the person, look, you're coming into an energy field, because I like to use that kind of terminology. It's a sort of nod to quantum physics and all sort of stuff, which I really like. That's another diversion altogether. But you would say to them, look, Uranus is the planet of disruption and left field change and things that come in unexpectedly. And what people really need when they have Uranus transits is freedom to do different things with their lives, things that open up new possibilities. That's coming to your Venus. And if you discover this person has been, let's say, married or in a partnership for, let's say, 10 years, then what you say to them is, look, either you or your partner is going to need quite a bit of freedom and space over the next period of time. And this is where astrology is so useful, because you can give people timings.
Yeah.
And that is so for this period of time, let's say a couple of years, and you can point out the peak points of that. Then what my advice to you would be if your partner decides they want to, for example, go off and study for a few years, and that would stretch the family budget or whatever, then try and let them do it. If you want more freedom yourself, then you need to tell your partner so that there's a bit more space around you. And applying that to my own life, when I started going down to the CPA, this was in the 1990s, my husband had started climbing all the mountains in Scotland. That was how he responded to his Uranus transit. He got on his boots and climbed 284 Monroes over a period of 12 years. And so I just thought, well, he needs to get on with this. And I want my own adventure. So he would go up north and climb mountains at the weekend. And I would fly down south, getting a plane at 7 in the morning and flying down to CPA and studying with Liz and company for a while. And then we would meet up and we would exchange our experiences. And that worked really well because we both were having an unusual and unexpected adventure. And it enhanced our relationship rather than damaging it.
Yeah.
So I think describing the essence, the archetypal essence of the combination of a natal planet and a transiting planet gives the person the freedom to recognize what they need to bring into their life, but lets them see that there are various branches arising from that. And I think that's good astrology practice, because if we say to somebody, if you see somebody who's got Jupiter going over their 9th house, Mars, and you say to them, oh yeah, I think you're going to be going traveling. I wouldn't be surprised if you ended up in Australia. If you get a postcard from them 3 months later saying, dear Anne, you were absolutely right, I am now in Melbourne, then rather than being pleased about that, I would feel absolutely appalled, because I would think that I'd set up a self-fulfilling prophecy for another person, because that can and does happen.
Yeah.
So I think we have to be very careful of our own power drives. I mean, that's one of the reasons I think that astrologers ideally need to be in some form of consultation or therapy or whatever, because, you know, it's very tempting to take on more power than you have the right to take on, and project it onto another person.
Indeed. Thank you, Anne. Anne, can I just take you back to when you first started studying astrology? Because the other day when we spoke, you mentioned that you cast your grandparents' charts, and I presume you cast other family members' charts as well.
Oh yeah, I think it's the first
that.
thing we all do. It's the first thing we all do. Well, I mean, I shouldn't be speaking for whoever is watching me. I do apologize for that. It's not very fair, but I think it's a very common thing for astrologers to go, oh, I want to see what's in my dad's chart. I want to see what's in my mother's chart. And that uncle I can't stand. I wonder if I could get his birth data and try and work out what I can't stand, this sort of thing. And I had drawn up, one of the advantages of being an astrologer in Scotland, by the way, is that birth times are written on birth certificates, so you can get accurate timings. That's been really fantastic for a practitioner, makes life a lot easier. Yeah. But anyway, I was close to 3 of my 4 grandparents. One of them was unwell and died when I was very young. But my 2 grandfathers and my grandmother. And I thought, I'm going to look at the horoscopes of the grandfather and the grandmother who I feel closest to in terms of seeing some of my own characteristics in both these people and watching how they conducted their lives, because they were both quite rebellious, adventurous people in their own different ways. So I decided that I would now there's my grandmother Whitaker and my grandpa MacLeod, because I was born and brought up in the island of Lewis in the Hebrides, and different people, different ages, born at different times. And I thought, I'm going to progress their charts, both of them, to my birth date. Now, my midheaven is 28 or 29 Taurus, and my ascendant is 9 degrees Virgo. And not one, but both these grandparents, their ascendant for the year of my birth and their midheaven for the month of my birth was 9 degrees Virgo on the ascendant for both of them, and 28 Taurus. And I have my North Node at 28 Taurus as well. So I was stunned. I was so shocked and stunned. I had to go for a walk in the local park to try and digest this. And then I came back, and a week later, I thought I must have made a mistake here. I recalculated. And incidentally, I was writing an article about this about 10 years ago, and I recalculated again just in case. And these grandparents who I most closely identified with had the same angles as I had when I was born.
That's pretty.
And the way I wrote about that was I felt as though I'd been touched by the wing of a great mystery.
Yes, yeah, that is extraordinary. It's going to make a lot of us go back and look at our grandparents' charts if we can, and at the moment of our birth, and see how it plugged in to their charts.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I only knew one grandmother. Who was alive.
No, it was so moving, and it made you realize both that we're part of something vast, but also it made you realize the profound wisdom there is in astrology, which is as above, so below. Everything is intricately interconnected. And anyone who's looked at their family's horoscopes, and I have a laugh with my family because my husband had Virgo rising, I have Virgo rising, my stepson has Virgo rising, my stepdaughter has Venus in Virgo, her stepfather who used to be married to my sister, and that's another story, had Virgo rising, and one or two other members of the family also. My sister had a Virgo midheaven, and my brother had loads of planets in Virgo. So you can see, I mean, those of you who are listening will have done this kind of stuff with their own families, and you can see all these overlaps all the time. You know, energy draws in energy. I used to wonder why, given that I was an interesting and exciting Leo person, I didn't know at that point that I had several planets in me, why I was attracting all these boring Virgo Pisces people. And then, of course, I did my chart and discovered that I had Virgo rising and Pisces on the descendant. So that was a bit of humbling. That sort of kicked a bit of leonine arrogance out of me, I'll tell you. And I used to wonder why these boyfriends I had with Pisces on the descendant were either musicians or heavy drinkers or druggies or both or all of them at once. And I used to have to drag them out of pubs at all sorts of stages in my teens and 20s. Needless to say, I moved on a bit from that. You know, that stopped. But, you know, you meet yourself wherever you go. And astrology is a wonderful way of letting you see these things in symbolic form. It's amazing, really.
Yes, indeed. So I was just tuning into the fact that you were talking about Virgo and Pisces, because my sun is in Virgo and my ascendant is Pisces.
There you go. You see, and what are you doing? You were cheering me up on a Monday morning, and I really felt as though I was on a wavelength with you, and I discovered that.
Good.
No surprises about all of that. But at the same time, it's quite magical. It really is.
Yes, indeed. And I have, well, I've never tested this, but in reference to my own chart and my family, I wonder whether certain family members, like aunts, uncles, etc., might be represented by a single planet in one's chart as well. Because I feel that in my chart that my Venus in Leo was very much connected with my great aunt, who had a love of art, and she was quite wealthy and glamorous in some ways. And I just feel that she sort of opened the door to understanding Venus in my own chart.
Well, I must check out with you now, because I have Venus in Leo. What degree is your Venus?
9 degrees.
Which is on my Mercury, and my Venus is 7 Leo. So it's hardly surprising that we get on, is it really?
Yeah, absolutely.
There you go. Yeah. There you go. See, this is us, astrology in action, people. Indeed. Right in front of you here now.
Anne, I know one of the things that you're particularly interested in is planetary cycles. And you've written on the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction. And I know that there are certain planetary cycles that you believe are particularly almost indispensable or fundamental. Would you like to say a little bit about those?
Yeah. If somebody once asked me, if you had to chuck out all the symbolic tools in your astrological toolbox and just keep a couple, what would you keep? And I didn't even have to think about it very long. I thought Jupiter cycle, the Saturn cycle, and the cycle of the progressed sun and moon. Because Jupiter is about how we open out to the world in various ways, and Saturn is about how the world defines us and limits us. So these are absolutely fundamental. And the Jupiter-Saturn cycle is recognized, as you know, as sort of the basis for studying movements in politics and civilizations and all the rest of it. It's a fundamental cycle. And I used to use this. The thing about being an astrologer and also being a private practice counselor who receives, I used to get referrals as a therapist and an astrologer, a therapist and a counselor from psychiatrists and GPs and so on. And here's where, as an astrologer, you have to be pragmatic. Because I knew fine that if I revealed to any of these people that I was an astrologer, they would not send me referrals. So I said, I'm sure this will strike a chord with a few people out there. So I solved this problem by using my own name, which I've always used my own name, but using my married name, which is Halliburton. My husband was called Ian Halliburton. I ran my therapy and practice under Halliburton and my astrology practice under Whitaker. But what would happen is that my therapy clients would come in for sessions, and they didn't, if the subject of astrology came up, they were obviously interested in those dimensions of life. And I would say, well, you know, that is what I do if you want me to refer you on to somebody to get your chart done. Because in my opinion, it would have been very inappropriate for me to have crossed these boundaries. Yeah. So occasionally people would say, oh yeah, I'm really interested. But what I would do is you always know people's age. And I would always ask my clients their age, as any therapist would. And I found it extraordinarily helpful to know if somebody was 29 to 30, or if they were 35 to 36, because 29 to 30, as we know, is the first major defining Saturn cycle. And then 35 to 36 is the second Jupiter cycle. The Jupiter 11 to 12, my arithmetic's never been very good, folks. I failed the O-level twice. So it's a miracle I ever learned to calculate a chart. First Jupiter cycle is 11 to 12. The second one is 23 to 24. The third one is 35 to 36. The fourth one is 47 to 48. And the next one is 59, 60. And people coming up to 59 or 60 or around that age, or people anywhere between 57, 58, 62, 63, you knew that they were going through a Jupiter cycle and a Saturn cycle, and what that actually meant. And you could work out, because of their age, what planet or what sign those cycles were going through. And it's amazing the amount of information that I was able to use to contextualize where my clients were at, and particularly the Jupiter cycle. Because, I mean, if you're, I don't know, how Jupiterian are you? Are you well connected to Jupiter?
No, I've got Jupiter in Capricorn, conjunct Saturn, and it's retrograde.
Oh, you're a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction person. So
sorry?
May I ask you when you were born?
Yes, September 1961.
1960, 1961.
Yeah.
So you are very much of both. Both of these would be woven very closely together in you. Yeah, I would imagine. Please. So do you want to say anything about that, or would you rather I didn't ask?
No, that's fine. I was reading your book earlier. I'd got to the bit about the Jupiter and Saturn cycles.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, I'll just think back to some of my Jupiter returns, because I always think when I'm in them that, oh God, nothing great is happening. You know, well, what's so special about a Jupiter return? But I thought back, and I think when I was 23, 24, I got my first computer with a view to writing, with a view to drawing up charts. I mean, I was doing them by hand before that point, but also with a view to writing an astrological database of everything that I thought I knew at that tender age. And then I hadn't really thought about this until I read what you wrote, Anne. And then I thought about the next one, which was in about 1996, 7. And that was when I started my first website called Interconnections, which was like a database of information on complementary health for people. And this was, back in the early days of the web, 1990, early 97. And then the next one, when I was...
Can I pause you for a second?
Yes.
Early 1997, the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction of 1997 happened on the 16th of February.
Right, yes, it was around that point. I think it started in April. Yeah, thank you. And then another one, when I was in 2020, I had a simultaneous Jupiter return and my second Saturn return. I was helping, well, there was the pandemic, and I was helping Aquarius 7 move to this medium that we're on tonight, Zoom, which was really exciting at the time for our group.
There you go.
I hadn't made that link before, so I really appreciated you getting.
Well, you see, I love all that. I think that's wonderful feedback, because Jupiter and Saturn together in your chart means that you're opening out to new possibilities. Always has this sort of Saturnian duty, grounding, responsibility, creating structures that are going to last, quality about it.
Yes,
but you don't get too overexcited about it. You just get on with it.
So waiting around for lots of Jupiterian goodies to happen during a Jupiter return doesn't work for me. But in hindsight, they were definitely, as you say, times of opening up and experimentation, if you like.
Well, this is the key. I mean, when I was 11 to 12, we all go to secondary education, 11 to 12. Then when I was 23, 24, I went and did my DPed and CertEd. I did my first teaching qualification. And then 35 to 36, I studied with the faculty. And 47 to 48, I flew up and down to London for years getting my diploma. And then 59 to 60, well, I was pretty conked out by a long Neptune transit at that time. But I moved into an office where I spent a year thinking about whether I was going to go on the web or not. And I thought, do I want the misery of this? Because I knew it would be partly miserable. But I thought, do I want to sink to the bottom of the pond like an ancient dinosaur wreck? And I thought, no, I don't want to be that sort of 60-year-old. I'm going to get on the web. So I hired some interesting young people to teach me. And that was when I opened out to computing and all the stuff that flowed from that.
So it's amazing.
And then 71, 72, I think, was when I was getting on with my first collection, the 60, I think it's either 59 or 60 essays in that Jupiter, in that Postcards to the Future book. It was quite a lot. And here I should pay tribute. I'm sure he's not listening, but I should pay tribute to my editor, Victor Oliver. What a patient man, editor of the Astrological journal. And he actually invited me to do a column there. And he said, "Anne, I'd like you to do a column." And I said, "Well, you've got an astrology column." He created a bit of a stooshy, a good Scottish word, Carol, stooshy, a bit of a stir up by having somebody doing astrology stuff in the journal. It's just sort of column type stuff. So I said, well, okay, but in the interest of fairness, I'm going to do not the astrology column. So he said, okay, you do that. So I've been doing it for nearly 10 years. And Victor edited my book superbly well, and I had a really good team of people, and Roz Saunders was the designer, and Kat Keane did the covers, and they were just fabulous. So, if I was going to, when I get round to getting my next book together, because I'm writing a book about the long Neptune dissolution I had between 2001 and 2008 was the worst of it. I'm going to be writing about that. I started writing about that. And as befits the fact that I now have a Neptune square Mars to look forward to for the next 2 or 3 years. So,
well, that's an ideal time to do it, isn't it?
Well, yeah, and I'm also going to be sitting in a little boat hole by the sea in Troon in Scotland, looking out the window, writing this book. So whether I'll do it or not, I don't know, because you know what Neptune is like. And to quote Liz Green again, I do love Liz's gnomic quotes. She said to us one time in the CPA, she said, this is talking about the planetary gods, you know, Uranus, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto. You've got to give the god what the god wants. And if it's Mars, do not offer a bunch of flowers. And I quote that a lot because I love it. And I think having been demolished by Neptune for several years, although it enabled me to lie on the sofa and catch up on 30 years of reading, and it enabled me to write a couple of things as well. But anyway, I have learned something about the god Neptune, and I am hoping that I can offer appropriately this time instead of fighting and resisting. So I may not write this book. I may lie on the sofa and drinking tea and eating biscuits and reading interesting books. I don't know. We'll see. But I think it's really important to be respectful of those energies. It really is.
Yes, indeed, indeed. Anne, I'm very interested in your thoughts about the moon's nodes as well. So that's another thing that you've written on. How do you see them in the natal chart? I mean, sometimes moon's nodes are presented as north node good, south node bad, north node future, south node past. What's your take on it?
All these things are kind of shorthand terms, which are okay up to a point. My favorite shorthand term for the moon's nodes comes from an astrologer called Michael Luton, who no doubt some of you will know. I came across this in an article in the Mountain Astrologer and laughed and laughed and laughed. I thought, this really is good. He talks about, he says, imagine, Michael Luton, if you happen to ever listen to this, and I've sort of slightly parodied what you said, I do apologize, but the essence of it is what you said. He said, okay, imagine somebody is in an AA, Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. The north node is the meeting, and the south node is the bottle. So in other words, you have to give up what's on the south node, because that's what's keeping you where you actually are and where your comfort zone is and where you really want to stay. Whereas the north node is pushing you to develop something which will be lasting and valuable and creative in your life. So south node, bottle, north node, meeting. And I think that's a very good shorthand term for it. But again, the nodal cycle fascinates me as well, because the north node returns to its position every 19 years. And I think that the nodal axis is about moving you towards where you are ideally meant to be in your life, if you can push yourself and you can deal with the discomfort of pushing yourself that way. I mean, for example, in fact, I saw a chart the other day with one of my mentorees, and this person, I must get this right, this person had a very strong Eastern bias chart, so most of his planets were on the East. His south node was exactly on his ascendant, and his north node was exactly on his descendant. And to me, that really, really spoke volumes. And the story that came out about this person reinforced this perception that the north node in this man's chart was about pushing him out of the East, out of his comfort zone, because most of his planets were on that side of the chart, on the ascendant side of the chart. And he had great difficulty with relationships. And, you know, there are various things signifying difficulty with relationships, but that north node on his descendant really spoke volumes about what he had to push himself towards. Mm-hmm. He was frightened of really opening up and exposing himself in relationship, and had difficulties, particularly with women. So that's a very, very graphic image of the nodal axis. And in my own case, I have the north node exactly conjunct my midheaven, and the south node exactly conjunct my IC. And what I've noticed in my life is that when good things, interesting developments are going on up at the top of my chart through my career, there's always something disastrous going on the family front. Right. Really. It never, ever fails. If I have a book published, or if I have something important happen or whatever, I know there's going to be some kind of unpleasant difficulty going on in the south node. And my sun is square the nodal axis from the 12th house. So, you know, the whole business of reconciling what you're meant to be and what your direction in life is with the challenges of where you're coming from is very much part of how my sun proceeds through the world. So these are just a couple of examples. But I think essentially, you know, you're looking at the nodal axis regressing through the horoscope. And whatever the axis is, let's say if you have, I don't know, the north node in the 4th house and the south node in the 10th. I mean, this is all, you know, this is all obviously very, very sort of shorthand stuff. Then where the south node is, you're okay. That's not the focus. The focus is where the north node is. And you very often find if someone's got the south node up in the north and the north node, the south node up in the 10th house, and the north node in the 4th, then it's time to do work on family of origin stuff.
You mean by progression?
Sure.
You're talking about progressions.
No, transits. The transiting nodal axis.
Yeah.
So, and then if somebody's nodal axis is very strongly emphasized, then particularly the nodal returns of 18 to 19 years, 18 to 19, 37, 38, mid-50s are very significant. I mean, in my own case, now this doesn't happen to everybody, but on my first nodal return when I was 19, my boyfriend of the time was killed in a car crash. Then the eclipses, of course, are tied in with this as well. And then 37 to 38, my father died suddenly. And here we come into the territory of astrology as a wounding as well as a healing art. Because I looked at these eclipses because the eclipses, you know, follow the nodal axis, and these when you have a pair of houses emphasized, the eclipses are also emphasizing them as well, which potentizes the whole thing. So I was really quite frightened when I was looking at the nodal axis coming up to the 56, 57 return point. I thought, who's going to die this time? But in fact, the configuration was different. I can't remember exactly, but the eclipses weren't so significant as they had been in the previous ones, and nothing serious. I mean, I was conked out at the time, and I can't quite remember what happened, but those two were so striking, and it really freaked me out.
Yeah.
So I do think that we don't talk enough. I mean, in my book is a long essay and mini study, qualitative research study of my students' responses to considering astrology as a healing and a wounding art. That's actually the title of the piece, and it was originally published in the Mountain Astrologer quite some time ago. And I got my students, I mean, I don't know if you were involved in this, Carol, or not, but I got my students who had been practicing for a while so they could see both sides of the whole thing, what their perception was of the healing as opposed to or complementing the wounding aspects of astrology. And I had their charts, you know, obviously with their permission, although I changed their names because I'm very scrupulous about people's privacy if I'm using charts and lives for research. And it was really quite moving and very interesting. I mean, anyone who has the book, if you haven't got to that particular section yet, or if you're going to buy the book, I have to do a wee plug here. If you're going to go and buy the book, then you will find quite a long exposition on the relationship between the healing and wounding aspects of astrology. But if you take this art up, then I talk for myself, but I know from my students that when they begin to realize the implications of some of the recurring patterns and cycles, then as well as being enhancing and informative, it can be really quite frightening. And I found that with my students, the two planets that were most scary for them were recurrences of Saturn and recurrences of transits of Saturn and transits of Pluto. But what I used to say to them was, look, the human race has got through most of its history with most people not knowing anything about their transits, and somehow they've still got through. So, you know, you've got to take that perspective. You know, life goes on. I mean, I would never reach for the ephemeris as soon as I woke up in the morning. I think you have to live your life, and I think you have to people can become addicted to astrology, and I think that's not necessarily a good thing. But I think we need to be honest and aware of the scary side of it. I don't know what your thoughts are about that, Graham. I'd be interested to hear what you think about that.
Well, I just want to go back to the nodes for a moment, because I just want to share something that came to me from a very wise friend who's sadly passed away a few years ago now, who I used to meet in a cafe every week. He was discussing where he was at in his life at that moment. And I looked, I think because he had a knowledge of astrology, I think he had Neptune crossing his south node. And it made me, he was just sort of doing nothing, but quite happy. He was quite aware of actually the need to do nothing at all in life, which was a bit alien to him. And it made me wonder whether the South Node has something to do with the idea of letting go of control, and also non-doing, like the Eastern idea of non-doing. I think it's a Taoist idea of just going with the flow, which we're not really used to in the West. We're used to thinking, in terms of the will and achievement and, getting our life in order, etc. And it made me think of the South Node in a slightly different way. But whereas the North Node is about constructive use of the will to develop and learn new things and go new places. Maybe the South Node is a place where we just let go and be.
Well, that's very interesting in relation to Neptune, because when I had my long Neptune transit, which began really with a member of our family having to come home for refuge, and at a time which was, it was a perfect storm for me. Long story short, my energy burnt out. I had to give up work. I had to retreat for quite a few years to recover. But the thing is, I was thinking about my nodes at the time and thinking, well, the South Node is the place of safety. It's the place of retreat. It's a place of comfort. And I had spent too much time putting energy up. I mean, if you can imagine having the MC right on the North Node, you don't have much of a chance to avoid call of career or careers in my case. And I hadn't given myself enough time. Although I had a happy and long-lasting marriage with my husband, eventually when I got to my 30s, I got enough sense to make the right choice. If I'd chosen anyone before that, it would have been disastrous. But anyway, so I had, if you like, been out of balance. I'd been too North Nodey and not sufficiently South Nodey. And what that Neptune transit forced me to do was basically retreat into my home.
Yeah.
And that was where I felt safe. And I really spent a lot of time in this actual room. You can just about see the sofa over there. I spent a lot of time lying on that sofa, reading and thinking.
Being nourished, Well, Anne,
and that was the South Node.
Yes, indeed. So there's healing in the South Node. Anne, I could speak to you for ages, but I'm conscious that we've talked for an hour, and I think other people would like to participate. So I think we've got some. We welcome any questions or comments on the topics that have been raised this evening. Or any other questions for Anne, but nothing about your own personal birth chart, please.
Not unless it illustrates some universal theme that we would all be terribly interested in. But I should say to anyone coming up with questions, I'm quite chilled about people's questions, because if I don't know the answer, all you have to do is ask Mr. Google or ChatGPT, as per our conversation earlier.
Right.
So with that proviso, fire away. What would people like to ask or comment?
So yeah, and if you'd like to ask something, then please use the raise hand at which is on the react section at the bottom of the screen, and we should see you there. I was particularly struck when I was working as an astrologer of finding that the space you leave for the client is for them to tell me what their chart was meaning, rather than me imposing as
Yep.
yeah, and which some very sort of psychoanalytical background astrologers do, but yeah.
No, I would certainly agree with that, and that's why these two questions: why are you here? Why now? And well, I suppose it's three questions. And what do you wish to get out of this? Frees the client up to share what it is they want to know, and puts you, as it were, in your place, I think.
I think we've got a couple of raised hands.
Yeah, so Ruby, I want to ask you.
Yeah, hello. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh, perfect.
I can hear you loud and clear.
This is my first time at this particular group, so yeah, it's been really fascinating actually. And thank you, Anne. I could listen to you for hours. I could just sit back and close my eyes and just listen to you talk about astrology all day. So yeah, that it's been really enjoyable. But I don't know if this is a question so much as I guess it's not a question. It's more just a reflection on something you said, really. And I hope you don't mind me saying this, but I just happened to notice when you were talking about when you discovered astrology with the young people that you went to the house for a cup of tea, that if I've got my maths right, you started astrology, well, seriously anyway, when you were around 36, which would have been your third Jupiter return. And I thought to myself, and that's really interesting. And I scurried around on my emails and noticed that actually that's when I started seriously studying astrology. And I thought, let me just pull up my chart quickly and check. And sure enough, it was 36 at my third Jupiter return. So it just made me think that Jupiter's connected to religion in some sense. And I just wonder if, a Jupiter return, especially the third one, there's a point at which on a soul level, you're ready to discover your religion, whatever that religion is, or your faith, your sense of faith,
I think that's a wonderful observation. What's your name? Ruby.
Ruby.
I think that's a wonderfully thoughtful observation. I think it's useful to check out also what sign your Jupiter is in, because mine is in Scorpio in the third house. So, I mean, I need to delve deeply and really, explore across a broad base as well. And I think you're right. Jupiter is about, the essence of Jupiter is opening out to new possibilities, new realizations about the world, and creating a context for yourself that's meaningful. So within that context, what you say is absolutely spot on. I mean, astrology, I spent my 20s being pretty nihilistic, really, for various reasons. And the great gift of astrology for me, in essence, was it showed me that my life does not consist of being a random butterfly pinned to the board of fate. It has meaning, it has context, it has its rhythms, its seasons, its growth and its development and its decline. And if we can set ourselves within the context of the cycles, then I think, one can have a much more actualized life than otherwise. I really do. So I'm delighted that you went and did that. That's great, because my job as an astrologer is to inspire people. And now that I'm an elder, I'm not pursuing a career anymore. I say to my friends and family that I'm in my post-career life, and I intend to fall over still teaching or doing astrology. I wouldn't fall over in the middle of a reading. That would be too alarming. That's possibly one of the reasons why I packed it in when I was just over 70. But I think that really, it's a gift. Astrology has been a great gift to me because it's let me see that to everything there is a season and a time for every purpose under the heaven. And if we can feel that our tiny wee life has got some sort of place in the big picture, and that we can use our energy constructively, then that's the best I think any of us can hope for.
Thank you. Spoken as a true elder.
It doesn't matter what religious context you place yourself in my opinion. It's finding a path that means you can use your creative energy to its best expression that really matters, I think.
Yeah.
Thanks for that.
Thanks for that, Ruby. I see Wendy has, you've got your hand up as well.
Yes.
Just you bring you on.
Can you hear me?
Hello. Yes, hello, Wendy.
Fascinating talk. I was particularly interested in the talk about the nodes. I have South Node on my ascendant and so North Node. And would you say, how it seems to me, it's the sort of area where you've got to balance things, where it's hard to balance things. You pulled in both.
I think you're absolutely right. Because, you know, the example I gave of my own life showed that I was really out of balance when it came to putting energy and time into just nurturing myself and I was always out working until Neptune flattened me. And so I think you're absolutely right that you have to find some kind of point.
And you never quite get it because it balances.
Our lives are a work in progress. I mean, we never quite get it as far as our lives are concerned. I mean, we're on a learning curve all the time.
And it seems to me that the house position is more important than the sign position in that regard.
Well, we could have quite a long discussion about that, but I would broadly speaking agree with you, because the sign position, everyone born within the same period of time as you gives us the same sign position, whereas your house position is tailored to your birth time. So from that point of view,
it feels a lot more personal.
If you're looking at generational developments or social developments, then probably where the sign has a bearing on that. But otherwise, personal astrology, I think it's the angles, the planets, and the position that matter. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thanks, Wendy. And Helen.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much, Anne. This has been absolutely fascinating. And speaking of Neptune transits, do you have any advice or insights regarding Neptune in conjunct natal Uranus? Especially in regards to giving the god what the god wants. I presume that refers to, I only started studying astrology at a very advanced age in 2020 during the pandemic.
Never too late. It is never too late.
But I presume that giving the god what the god wants refers to the transiting planet. So in this case, it would be Neptune.
Well, I would be reluctant to comment on that specific to you without seeing your whole chart, because I think one has to be really careful. I mean, on the face of it, Neptune conjuncting Uranus in somebody's horoscope is an outer planet conjuncting an outer planet. So the theory is that shouldn't have much of an impact. But if you have Uranus, say, opposite Venus, then a Neptune comes over Uranus, then it's going to impact both Uranus and Venus. Or Uranus and
sorry, Anne. Sorry, I said that. I made a mistake. It was in conjunct. Neptune in conjunct Uranus.
Well, it's the same basic principle. You would have to take the whole path that it was involved in into account. So if you had another planet linked in with that in conjunct, which was a personal planet like Mercury or Mars, then you would need to take into account the impact of Neptune on Uranus and Mars. So you would definitely see something very definite there. But I would have thought that, generally speaking, opening up to big pictures is very much going to be on the agenda. If you've got personal planets linked with Uranus and then Neptune comes along, you're going to want to connect to higher powers in some way, shape or form. And in my case, it was a form of conking out for years and having to pay attention to stuff that I wouldn't have time to do otherwise. So you really need to see what the personal and the collective influences are there in your chart. I'm really glad to hear you started studying astrology. It's a brilliant subject. It's great fun. You never get to the end of it ever.
It's true.
Ever.
Definitely. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Helen. And there was a comment Bethy has asked me to read out. So she says, I think it's really important that we make sure people aren't suffering from mental illness before we give them a reading. So it's great that you were able to look out for this. Do you think we should be giving a short questionnaire or something similar before a reading? We shouldn't forget we hold people's futures in our hands.
Well, I think that's a very thoughtful and a very responsible observation and question. I think that different astrologers work in different ways. I mean, one of my students who's really very, very gifted astrologer gives out, she goes into get people filling in a certain amount of questionnaire before they come to see her, which is great. But I mean, the way I have always worked is from nothing but the birth data. And I think I was very heavily influenced by my own initial experience of astrology because these people knew nothing about me. So the astrology spoke very clearly to me. And because although I have all these 12th house planets and I'm quite sensitive in many ways, I am a pragmatic person. I mean, Saturn is very strong in my chart. So Saturn, Mercury, takes a lot to convince me of anything, really. And I think that's a very useful characteristic for an astrologer to have, because there's lots of sort of flaky stuff around the edges of our art, unfortunately, which the net has only amplified. But let's not get onto one of my hobby horses, or we'll be here all night. But I think different astrologers work in different ways, and I would not give out a questionnaire to anyone. I would get their birth data and make notes based on the kind of archetypal patterns, and maybe think about some of the branches that could arise from them, and then put it away and respond to the client. That's my way of working. I prefer not to know anything about them and for them to tell me. And, it's not always possible to work like that, because if you have some sort of slight link with somebody and you know a wee bit about them, like if it's somebody well-known who comes to consult you, then you can't help knowing stuff about them. But I think the ethical thing to do there is, if somebody well-known comes to see you, you don't Google them. You just don't do that. You just don't do that. I think it's reprehensible to find out about a person from the internet and then ascribe that knowledge to yourself through how you're reading their chart. And people shouldn't do that. Anyway, I hope that's answered your question. Horses for courses, if that's the way you want to work, inquirer, then that's great. But I do think that having some sort of knowledge of mental illness to be able to spot the signs, so that you know that this person requires help, which goes beyond your competence as an astrologer, is really quite important. It's very important, actually.
On that subject, if you felt that somebody had a particular mental health problem, I don't know, say psychosis, would you actually say that to the client? How would you broach that referral to a specialist?
That's an extremely good question, and I'm trying to run through my chart memory banks to see if I ever actually had something as clear as that. Let me think.
Or do you get them to think
in a situation like that, I think in a situation like that, you really have to work with your responses and your instincts and everything you can bring to bear in deciding what you would say and what you wouldn't say. I mean, I can't immediately say, but I would be very gentle with this person. And I know I've had people coming for readings where I have absolutely recognized that to go into some of the dark stuff that was showing would not be appropriate for them because they seemed to be too vulnerable.
Right. Yeah.
So I would be very gentle with them, and I would really, I think as a good astrologer, you have to try and be as honest as possible with your clients, but you mustn't use honesty to bruise them or damage them. So I would just say very little, just not give the quality of reading I would normally give, but just touch on the outsides of it, and then if I could open up a discussion with that person about how they were feeling, how their mental health was, and would they like a referral on to a psychiatrist or a GP or something. If I could do that, then I would do it. But I think you have to judge each situation on its merits when you see the person. But I think that having a good background in some kind of psychological work is definitely helpful in making these kinds of judgments. Have you had to deal with anything like that, Graham?
I haven't actually.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
I'm just recalling when I was doing counselling training, and these questions come up all the time. Everyone thinks they're going to get really challenging mental health cases, but unless you're working in that field, generally it's the sort of same stuff that we all go through at various times. So it's quite a surprise if something really does come up that dramatic, isn't it?
I think that's a fair point, but I mean, I have a couple of, I don't know if I've got time to tell you this, but as a woman working on my own, initially from my home and then from offices, one has to be pragmatic about one's personal safety. And there have been 2 occasions only where I have been preparing a man's chart, and I've thought, I don't want to be alone with this person without any possible avenue of help. So on both occasions, I've had, I think it was my brother on one occasion, and then a close male friend on another, be in the house at the same time as the reading. And one of the 2 things, this guy walked through the door and he looked like the Yorkshire Ripper, who was a mass murderer in the 1980s or 1990s. He looked like him. And I thought, thank God my brother's in the other room. And it turns out that this man was perfectly affable, really difficult 8th house, all kinds of real significators that made me feel very nervous. But he was fine. He was unconscious of a lot of this stuff. I mean, some of the issues he brought up to do with sexuality and so on were, quite difficult, but nothing that seemed to me to be pointing to danger to me or other people out there. But I was so glad to have a male person in my house just in case. And I think these are things that you have to sometimes take into account. Really?
Yes. Sorry, Graham.
So I was just going to say that goes back to trusting astrology, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. It actually does.
And I say, yes, we need to look after our clients, but we also need to look after ourselves as well. So, yeah. Well, I feel we're probably, there's no more hands raised at the moment, so I feel we probably ought to let you go soon, Anne and Graham. So, yeah, thank you very much, Anne, for a very wide-ranging and interesting discussion. There's lots of appreciation in the chat box, and also thank you to Graham for so ably facilitating that conversation